This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and author of a new book entitled Becoming Israeli, National Ideals and Everyday Life in the 1950s, that was recently published in English by Brandeis University Press. The book adopts a grassroots perspective on the much-touted Israeli melting pot of the early state years that created a quasi-homogeneous culture almost out of nowhere, and rather than exploring how it was imposed from above, the book engages in the everyday practices of adoption and resistance alike that ended up shaping it the way we know it today. Dr. Anat Helman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi Gilad and hi Alex.
Alex is our technical engineer here. So the sector of the Israeli society of the 1950s that you focused on were what you call in your book long-timers. That is, people who had been in Israel long enough to develop a relationship with the cultural project of Zionism, and that relationship turned out to be more ambivalent than we may think. So please tell us about this ambivalence and where it came from.
Well, first of all, long-timers weren't that long-timers. I mean, that's an immigrant society in any case, but they came before the new immigrants of the post-state era. That's what made them long-timers. And this Zionist culture was a culture that they actually consolidated during the Yeshuv era, the Mandate era, before the foundation of the state. It's not as if there was a Zionist culture which they brought with them as a whole parcel and then tried to maintain it, but rather they had to create this culture gradually. But by the time the state was founded, something of a culture, a dominant Zionist culture, was already in place. And that was the thing that the old-timers wanted to maintain. For them, this was the option. Okay, we tend to take the multicultural ideals of our day and try to look at that earlier period through this prism. And that's a bit misleading because for these old-timers, there was one proper Zionist culture, and that's the one they consolidated before the state was founded. Okay. So for them, the project was to integrate the new immigrants into this culture and to make them proper Israelis.
That was predominantly Ashkenazi, secular, socialist-oriented.
Yes, socialist-oriented to a certain degree, certainly Ashkenazi. Many people call this a Western society as opposed to a culture, as opposed to an Oriental culture. But I think this is very misleading because most of the old-timers were not from the West. They were from East Europe, or Central Europe is Western enough. But most of them came from Eastern Europe. They had very strong Western aspirations, but they were not direct representations of the Western cultures. Okay? So, yes, this culture was Ashkenazi. It was mainly secular. It was, to a great degree, orientated in socialist ideology, which was a dominant ideology in the Yeshuv and later on in the state.
And the people you focus on, rather than the leaders and the people high up who were very ideological and part of their mission was to really impose that kind of culture, those people were at the same time the recipients of that imposition and the people who perpetuated it.
Yes, that's right. And they perpetuated it in different manners, not exactly as subscribed by the pure ideology. Okay, even people who belonged to this group, to this long-timers, the more comparatively wealthy people in that society, and the people who were more confident in their identity as Israelis, due to these factors. These people did not necessarily implement every single detail from this Israeli culture and ideology. Mm-hmm. And I find it interesting to see how these people appropriated the ideology in their everyday lives.
And how did it come about?
Well, I try to look at different fields of activity. Some of them are topics of interest. For example, militarism. How did people react to military society, to the military presence, mm-hmm. and in different ways which are not directly to do with military service or with the army or with war, mm-hmm. in their speech, such as in their speech. Okay? For example, how they adopt words which are to do with battles and the military and use it in totally non-military issues. Okay? Or how they deal with it.
Sasha, can you give an example?
Oh yes, the word mivtza became very, very common in Israeli language during and after the war.
Which means operation.
Which means, yes, it means operation. But the word operation was used for everything. For example, a cultural activity, building up a stadium for a sport event. Everything became a mivtza. And a couple of years later, it became a mivtza. We say mivtza for end of the season deals in shops, right? Mm-hmm. But the word mivtza, which originally is about military operations, became very widely used in many different fields after the war.
Mm-hmm. And another topic that maybe a longitudinal topic that you explore is the attitude towards the austerity policies and rationing that was really prevalent in the social discourse and obviously affected the daily lives of every Israeli in the early 50s.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in this case I decided not to write about once again the conscious, the ideological reactions to the tzena, to this rationing. The austerity policy and the austerity reality. The austerity was, as you say, a very determining factor for the everyday lives, although it was not the only part of the economic policy, which the centralistic policy of the 1950s. So I didn't want to see once again how people reacted in the newspapers by writing this is the right thing to do economically or the wrong thing to do. I wanted to see how they dealt with it through humor. Mm-hmm. So how
another thing that you avoided is, of course, how they engaged in all sorts of black market activities, which is also a very common.
Important. It's very important. It's mentioned, of course, but once again, I looked at the black market as it appeared in jokes and in humor. So I look at the mechanism of humor. I think it's a very good mechanism to investigate the everyday life through, because it's something which is intertwined into daily reality. Mm-hmm. It can be subversive, but it can also be a very strong mechanism of safety valve. That is, people can channel their aggression, their frustration into humor. Mm-hmm. So it can be a way to deal with the black market, but it can also be a way of replacing the black market with something.
So this is through humor and those practices, those people actually squared the circle, as it were, dealt with the contradictions that reality imposed on them?
Yes, that's the main thing. I think that we as historians, we try to tell a story, and in order to tell a story, we want a circle or a square, whereas in our lives, and in our player's life, our historical player's life, sometimes you can't put reality neither to a square nor into a circle. You really have to live with this conflict, constant conflict, this dissonance. Yeah. Okay, so practices in daily life, I think they're a good example of how we do that. Whereas when we have to define our ideas, we have to define a square or a circle. In our daily lives, we can have the square and the circle simultaneously.
And so your endeavor was slightly psychological as well, because it went into the psyche of those people and tried to understand what motivated them to act the way they acted.
Yes, certainly. It was a bit sociological, a bit anthropological, only relating to the past rather than the present. But it's also a very short time span. Historians usually want to look at the longue durée, and they take, my former research was at least 2 decades, and now I only look at these few years after the foundation of the state, and that too is a bit more sociological than historical in its viewpoint.
Another interesting aspect, other than the topics that you tackle, is the public spaces that you dedicate much of your research to, some of which are the bus, the experience of taking the bus in the 1950s Israel, the kibbutz dining halls, and cinemas, but not the actual films themselves, but the experience of cinema going.
Yes.
In principle, why did you choose mundane experiences such as this, and how did they enrich your exploration?
Well, the mundane part is easy. I'm looking for the mundane. I'm looking for the ordinary. I'm not saying that the extraordinary isn't interesting per se, but to me...
But these are exceptionally mundane. Taking the bus isn't anything to write home about normally.
Well, that's exactly the point. That's exactly the issues. The most boring issues are, for me, the most interesting. Okay, so
that's not a very good selling point, but let's go.
Yes, it is. But the thing is that I wanted to take 2 spaces, one from work and one from leisure. And how do you get to work? Usually by transportation. And in the 50s, very few people had private transportation, so they took the bus. So that's the bus. And there are so many very thick descriptions of taking the bus in the 1950s. It was really easy to reconstruct this mundane activity and then analyze it. And then I wanted to take an everyday activity from the leisure part of life. And the most popular leisure activity was going to the movies. So I took going to the movies. When it comes to the kibbutz, as you know, Gilad, I was born and bred in a kibbutz myself. I find this society very interesting. I wanted to write about the kibbutz society, among other things, because the kibbutz in the 1950s, despite a crisis in the kibbutz movement, was still considered the height of the Zionist ideology implemented.
Why a crisis? Was the heyday of the kibbutz movement?
No, the kibbutz, the heyday was the 1940s.
Right.
Kibbutz after the foundation of the state.
Ideological split?
No, not just the ideological split, the pilug, the ideological split in the kibbutz, the Meuchad movement. It was also an economic crisis. It was also a crisis, a demographic crisis, because many kibbutz members left the kibbutz. And it was a crisis because the kibbutzim were not as successful in absorbing new immigrants as they expected from themselves and as the leaders expected from them, especially Ben Gurion. So it was a crisis. But nonetheless, the kibbutzim were still considered the epitome of the Zionist fulfillment. And therefore, it's interesting to see how things in the everyday life of the kibbutzim were actually going on during this period. So I took the most public and central institute in the kibbutz, the dining hall, and wrote about that.
I want to go back to the bus for a second.
Okay.
How was the experience of taking a bus in the 1950s different from what we know today?
Well, on the one hand, when the book came out, someone who read it told me I took a bus this week and nothing has changed.
Right.
However, I have to say things have changed.
Okay.
I mean, you have to be in the 50s in order to understand how inconvenient the bus rides were. The buses were not ventilated properly, not to mention air conditioning, of course. They were very bumpy, and every ride took hours. Actually, the experience of bus going, I checked it in my previous research in the Mandate era, deteriorated.
So it was better under the British?
Yes. Well, perhaps the complaining wasn't as prolific during the British Mandate era, so that might be a misleading factor. But in any case, it was described as a nightmarish experience. But on the other hand, it was a very colorful experience. People used to interact, even without knowing one another formally. And so it
created a community in a way?
In a way, not always a pleasant or a harmonic community, but yes, a certain community, a certain...
Yeah, and that brings me to the inevitable question, which of course, how do you accumulate all this data? That's really the drawback of writing unofficial history, is that you don't have archives, you don't have books to go to. I mean, the periods that you were researching throughout your career more than half a century ago, some of these people are still around, and even those who are still around, the memory probably isn't as fresh about all these mundane activities, which, you know, we don't really register, as well as the extraordinary activities. How do you go about it?
That's a tough one, because this, I think, is the reason why many people write about how one should write everyday life and the history of everyday life, rather than write the history of the everyday.
Because it's so difficult.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. But I have to say, after writing about everyday life in the Mandate era, that there are much more primary sources in the 1950s about this topic than in previous decades.
Primary sources, you mean people who are still alive?
No, I mean actually archival sources and clips from newspapers, whether it's an article or something which was said apropos writing about a different topic. You have to look a lot between the lines in order to reconstruct the everyday. But nonetheless, the 1950s are quite prolific when it comes to this. And I think it's something which isn't only Israeli. It's to do with the feuilleton, this genre of writing about the mundane, which became more popular. And perhaps also the 1930s and 40s being so ideological, and then the 1950s as a sort of return to the home and the everyday. So there's something in the general Western culture which goes back to the family, to the everyday, to the household. And you have more sources in the 1950s than in previous decades. But the thing is to have very, very good research assistants, which I had. And this is the time to thank them. Arik Moran and Noach Benninga and Shira Meirson. And of course, Erez Hacker, the lead researcher. And they did a wonderful job.
Absolutely. And I second that completely. And also your recommendation to have good research assistants.
Yes, that's a very, very good tip.
I think
for everyone.
it's really applied across the board. Dr. Anat Helman, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, but thank you very much for coming in today to discuss your latest book, Becoming an Israeli, National Ideals and Everyday Life in the 1950s, that was recently published in English by Brandeis University Press. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
במקום שהיום נגמר, בזמן שהלב מתחיל, לילה חוזר ומתגבר, ונסגרים מעגלים, יש תנועה מדומה, והכבוד חוצות הרים, בחזרה לנקודה, בנסגרים מעגלים, מעגלים מעגלים.